Yo, what's good E7 fam? Pat here, back with another how to play video, and in this one we'll be talking about the fashionista who is not famous for fighting life fibers. I'm of course talking about designer Lilibet. As with all of these how to play videos, I'll be going super in depth and covering almost everything you could want to know about the character, including things like stats, skills, possible endgame equipment builds for you to try out, as well as PvP knowledge if that's your thing. So as always, with the introduction out of the way, let's talk about designer Lilibet's stats. Designer Lilibet is a dark warrior of the Cancer zodiac symbol. She shares a stat line with Alencia as well as Apocalypse Ravi. Taking a closer look at her stats, she has 975 attack, 7,054 health, 106 speed, 652 defense, 15% critical hit chance, 150% critical hit damage, 5% dual attack chance, and no effectiveness or effect resistance. Overall, this is a very good stat line for a warrior, especially one that is looking to be rather bulky or tanky. The attack stat is quite low, however, most warriors with this zodiac symbol do not scale off of attack, and designer Lilibet is no exception there. We'll talk more about her skills in the very next section, and she also again has 106 speed, which is fairly respectable if only slightly worse than average. As a bit of trivia before moving on to the skills section, in the Japanese dub of Epic 7, designer Lilibet as well as Lilibet are voiced by none other than Inori Minase, who you may recognize as the voice of ReZero's Rem, who we most recently talked about in How to Play Rem. Designer Lilibet was also designed by the artist Seren, who recently departed from Smilegate, and if you've been following any of the news in the community, you may be aware of them. They designed many of the game's most iconic heroes, including characters such as Arya, Angelica, and my personal favorites, Luna as well as Sirmia. Speaking of Sirmia, designer Lilibet in the English dub of Epic 7 is voiced by none other than Jeremy Lee, a voice actress who we talk about frequently here on this channel. You can find more of her roles in How to Play Lionheart Sirmia as well as How to Play Cerise. Thanks to Jeremy, I have a giveaway plan for you all sometime in the very near future, so if you're not already, please consider subscribing to the channel and please look forward to it. Designer Lilibet's S1 is Sliced to Pieces. It has a 0.6x attack multiplier as well as a 100% max defense multiplier. You acquire 25 fighting spirit upon use. This move has a 65 to 75% chance to silence the target for one turn. As far as S1 goes, this is actually pretty good when we look at it compared to other defense scaling heroes in Epic 7. She has the same multiplier as Lionheart Sirmia's S1, and if you recall from How to Play Lionheart Sirmia, that move was already strictly better than almost every other defensive scaling hero in the game, such as Fighter Maya. Designer Lilibet's S2 is her signature skill, Emergency Stitching. She starts the battle with 30 to 50 fighting spirit, depending on Molagora. At the end of an enemy's turn, she will gain 10 fighting spirit for every debuff on your team. When Lilibet's fighting spirit hits 100, she will consume all fighting spirit to cleanse all debuffs from herself, grant herself a 1-turn defense buff, and also gain 40% combat readiness. This is a very good passive, as it means that designer Lilibet is most likely taking the second turn in a match if your opponent tries any funny business with debuff characters and specific openers, namely Conqueror Lilius as well as Peyra. Those characters usually take 2 turns back to back with their debuffs, which means it's almost guaranteed that Emergency Stitching will trigger and give designer Lilibet the second turn in a match, which means that she's most likely going to follow up with her S3, Model Disqualification. Model Disqualification is an AoE attack with a 0.6x attack multiplier. It also has a 115% max defense multiplier. You acquire 3 souls upon use as well as 50 fighting spirit. It has a 4 to 5 turn cooldown depending on Molagora. This move decreases the duration of all debuffs on all allies by 2 turns, then performs an AoE attack that increases the skill cooldowns of all enemies by 1 turn. Additionally, this move will increase the combat readiness of all allies except for designer Lilibet by 15%. The combination of emergency stitching as well as the S3 model disqualification is the primary reason to play designer Lilibet. She's essentially kind of like a tanky bruiser that doubles as a very aggressive cleanser in certain matchups. Lilibet can punish certain openers really hard. Not only does she cleanse most debuffs, but resetting cooldowns can nullify enemy turns at worst, and at best, the combat readiness push can actually turn the tables and win the game for your team outright. Note, by the way, in that previous sentence that I said most debuffs, as certain debuffs, such as bombs, are unaffected by model disqualification. No one really does what designer Lilibet does in this game, at least not all in one package. Her kit is part bruiser, part debuffer, part cleanser, and part pseudo opener thanks to the combat readiness push on this S3 model disqualification. Going forward, you'll need to ask yourself what you want to get out of designer Lilibet, at least for the purposes of this video. She has no best in slot artifact and no real definitive build. You should just build her in a style that takes advantage of what you're trying to accomplish with the character, and we'll try to help you figure that out in the very next section when we talk about artifacts that you can play on this character and why you would choose them over various different other options. Designer Lilibet's Soulburn makes it so that her S1 has its effect chance increased to 100%. Note, by the way, that it says increases the effect chance to 100%. It does not ignore effect resistance, so unless you build your Designer Lilibet with high effectiveness, it's still not going to be able to hit those high ER characters, such as various different Soul Weavers throughout the game, such as, say, like Amelia or like a very high effect resistance Destina, for example. It's a fine Soulburn. I find myself using it largely against Apocalypse Robbie when I do use it. A lot of Apocalypse Robbies are on Proof of Valor, so what you can do is Soulburn Slice to Pieces to essentially keep her silence locked so that she can't use her S3 to revive specific characters. But outside of that specific use, it's kind of like touch and go. Not really a amazing Soulburn, but if you need it and you'll think that it'll clutch out a game, then by all means use it. When it comes to Molagora Priority, you have to max emergency stitching first. It gives you the fighting spirit to start the battle. You need to start with as much as possible so that way you can guarantee that designer Lilibet gets that second turn in the matchups that you really, really want her. After that, you want to put all of your Molagoras into model disqualification, not only for the cooldown reduction, but the damage as well. There are certain matchups where the extra damage actually does matter, so I think you do want to end up maxing this one out. And then after that, you want to invest in the S1 Slice to Pieces for the effect chance, at least as a minimum, but ideally, because this is a damage dealer, you do want her at plus 15. Normally in my how to play videos, I give you guys and girls 2 to 3 different artifacts that I think are really good on the character. They're ones that I can personally vouch for, or they're ones that I've seen members of the Epic 7 community have a lot of success with. They're basically tried and tested options. I can't really do that though with designer Lilibet, because this character can be played so many different ways and has so much synergy with a lot of the warrior artifacts in the game that it's really hard to just pick one clear definitive option or like 2 or 3 good ones. She has a lot of different options. This is not a character like Rem where you just jam Sigurd Scythe and that's clearly going to be the best option in every scenario. Designer Lilibet can be played as a speed set that is very high damage, very high speed, and then it could also be played as a speed set but with a lot of bulk and actually not really too much speed. You can also play this character on counter set, and the counter build can be either a damage-based counter build, or it can be one that's very annoying and is trying to silence lock specific people. And all of those different builds use different artifacts. So I want to take some time and talk about all of the different warrior artifacts that I think are fairly good on this character and why you would choose them. The very first one I want to talk about is Anti-Magic Mask, which I think is an excellent starting point. This will give you essentially immunity, increased attack, increased defense, increased critical hit damage, or increased speed at the start of your turn. Designer Lilibet can really take advantage of most of these. Speed is obviously very good, but attack, defense, and critical hit damage is just generically good for her. It just translates to damage because she scales off all of these on her damage multipliers for the most part. Immunity is the only real dud. So if you're looking for a damage-based artifact and you're not really sure what to play on the character, Anti-Magic Mask is a fairly good and safe starting point, especially if you have a high investment one. The next one to talk about is what I'm personally playing, which is Azure Comet at the moment. It gives 15% critical hit chance, which when combined with the imprint from designer Lilibet, which is also critical hit chance, you get a lot of free critical hit chance with this artifact, which translates to having very high gear score builds for your designer Lilibet because you're not having to worry about hunting down this critical hit chance, which is traditionally the hardest stat to actually get on most damage dealing characters. So if you're looking for a lot of stats, extra defense, extra health, extra crit damage, this is a fairly good artifact for you. You also get some value out of that combat readiness push, especially if you're playing her versus something like Cleave. If a teammate dies, that combat readiness might get you back in the game and help you win. Next one to talk about is Champions Trophy. This is one that I personally played for a fairly long time when I was playing a very tanky, like 17k plus HP designer Lilibet. It gives extra effectiveness for the silence, for the turn cooldown reset on her S3 model disqualification, and the stun is fairly nice as well. It is just a rock solid option, I feel like, overall, especially if you have a little bit of effectiveness on your designer Lilibet. Circus Fantasia is one that I can't really recommend, but if you're going for a high effectiveness build, this is definitely the one you would want to consider alongside Champions Trophy. Another one I can't really recommend, although could have big potential, is Creation and Destruction. My guildmates and I meme about this one all the time. Essentially, getting back-to-back model disqualifications can be very backbreaking and can win you quite a number of matches, so it is worth considering if you're just really not sure, although I think this is probably the worst one I'm going to talk about. One of the best ones I'm going to talk about, though, is Draco Plate. This is just a generically good warrior artifact. Gives you extra survivability as well as extra damage on the character. The problem is that Draco Plate is a highly contested artifact by many of the warriors in the game. So there's a good chance that if you have this artifact, it's probably on another character. And I would encourage you to probably keep it on that character because while it's good on designer Lilibet, there are a lot of options you can play on this character that aren't really playable in other spots, so you can look elsewhere. But if you have a Draco Plate, it's free, then it is a fairly good option for you. Next up, let's talk about Sigurd Scythe. This is one that I personally played for a long time as well, alongside Champions Trophy. If you have a very bulky version of designer Lilibet, she will naturally stay on the board for a very long time, and when she finally goes into Sigurd Scythe range, an S3 model disqualification will essentially put you back at full health and do a fair amount of damage. Problem is, Sigurd Scythe, just like Draco Plate, is a highly contested artifact, which means you might not have a lot of these to go around, but it is one that is worth considering. Durandal is another one that you might want to consider, especially if you are in a counter-based version of designer Lilibet. You can use this to supplement the lack of speed by gaining extra combat readiness. It's very similar to Azure Comet in that sense where you're just trying to leverage extra combat readiness with her S2 emergency stitching to kind of really make the character zoom, especially on builds that traditionally do not have a lot of speed. Next up is Snow Crystal. This is very akin to Moonlight Dreamblade for Thieves. If you somehow get a critical hit resist, that combat readiness can obviously, again, help you out and make you win specific games, just like we talked about with Azure Comet. This is one that is fairly new and I haven't had a lot of testing with, but I do think it is a fairly competent and solid option overall. Just adds survivability as well as a little bit of speed to the character, which is really nice. Looking at the common artifacts, a Symbol of Unity, as well as when we scroll down here, Portrait of the Saviors are just generically good options if you were just looking for high damage on your designer Lilibet. If you just want her to hit as hard as possible, these are pretty much the go-to artifacts for you. If you're looking for survivability, Proof of Valor is obviously going to be a fantastic option for you. Just recognize that this does not stack, so if you have Proof of Valor on a character like, say, Apocalypse Robbie, it won't, actually stack, so that's one that you really have to consider for the most part. But again, designer Lilibet has same stats as Apocalypse Robbie. Proof of Valor works great on Robbie. Why wouldn't it work here? And the last one to talk about here is Warhorn, which I don't really recommend because just like with Sigurd Sight and Draco Plate, there are many characters that really want Warhorn, like Mediator Queric and Conqueror Lilius. So odds are those characters probably should take your Warhorn first and foremost. But if for some reason your Warhorn is just not in use, this is just a fairly good artifact overall for any character, especially one with a high amount of utility like Designer Lilibet. If you paid attention to the last two sections, you might have an idea of how character builds will work in this video. It's going to be slightly different than some of my other how to play videos. I'm going to show you all two similar sets of stat lines, and where you take the character from there is going to depend on things like artifact choice, whether or not you want the character on speed set or counter set, and which specific two-piece offset you are looking to play on her as well. This first stat line is more for players that like to play aggressive. You basically want to get the most amount of damage possible out of Designer Lilibet, or you are just looking to have the fastest Designer Lilibet possible. When we take a look at the primary sets, we're going to be either on a speed set or counter set. It's going to be entirely your choice. For most players that are looking for this stat line, speed is better, although counter could still work with a similar stat line. I just think that the second stat line I'm going to show you is a bit better for counter because it's a lot bulkier. Looking at the offsets, defense set is going to be the most well-rounded set on this character. It gives you a decent chunk of damage as well as bulk. Hit is more for players that want to have very high effectiveness and guarantee they get their turn resets as well as get their silences. This is more geared, I feel like, towards counter set where you have more chances to actually proc silence on Designer Lilibet. So that's where that one comes in. Critical hit chance is going to be for players that don't have a lot of imprints on their character and are looking to get 100% critical hit chance wherever they can get it. It just makes it a bit easier. It's also really good for players that are not playing Azure Comet. Looking at the penetration set is the last one. This is for players that are looking to have the most amount of damage possible on their Designer Lilibet. It works fairly well with both speed and counter set. It's just, again, if you want your S1 and your off turns to be as impactful as possible damage-wise, penetration set will be that obvious pick there. Looking at the desired stats, I have 1500 attack. This is Designer Lilibet's base attack with an I-90 weapon. For defense, I have 1900. This is the lowest I would play on Designer Lilibet. She really needs a lot of defense in order to do her job. Ideally, for a speed set Designer Lilibet, 2000 would be ideal. If you're trying to play as much damage as possible, as aggressively as possible, 2100 defense would be the best case scenario. So somewhere between 1900 and 2100 would be great. The more defense you put on her, the more damage she's going to end up doing. Just make sure it doesn't impact the other stats too much. For health, I have 14k here. If you're trying to play a more balanced type Designer Lilibet, on speed that has a good amount of damage and a good amount of bulk, you want to shoot for 15k if you can get it. If you just really want as much damage on Designer Lilibet as possible, you can go even lower than this if you so choose, but around 14k should be the average for players that are trying to go for this style of build. Looking at the speed, I have 210. Realistically, anything over, I believe, 185 to 186 speed on Designer Lilibet is ideal because with the 40% combat readiness, she should almost always take the second turn with at least that level of speed, around 185 to 186. You'll almost always take the second turn. However, there are certain characters such as Conqueror Lilius that can have a combat readiness pushback on their S2 or whatever ability, and that will actually disrupt you, and you might not necessarily take the second turn, or they might have somebody like Politis. So mathematically, the best speed for you to have is like 210 to 220 if you were trying to actually guarantee you get that second turn even through a pushback. So if you're looking for that, if that's what matters the most to you, is to make sure you lock in that second turn, shoot for 210 or better. 220 would be ideal. But if you don't care about being pushed back by Conqueror Lilius, you're not super worried about getting run over by Cleave or very aggressive compositions, you can drop this as low as, again, like I said, 185 to 186. That includes counter set. If you're on counter set, make sure you're at least over that 185 to 186 speed threshold. Critical hit chance, I have 100% here, just so that way we can get off as much damage as possible. Critical hit damage, I have 270%. If you don't care as much about critical hit damage, you can drop it down to 250. If you're just trying to get, like, say, the speed is the only thing that matters to you, then you can drop the critical hit damage down to like 250. If damage is what matters most to you, you can drop your HP and your speed a little bit in order to get that defense to that 2100 mark like we talked about, and we can get that critical hit damage even higher, like say 280 or 290, or even if you have like really insane gear, 300, that's fine. For effectiveness, I have 0% here. How much you need is going to depend on what you're trying to do with the character. If you're just trying to silence, DPS that on a counter, for example, then you don't really need that much effectiveness, if any at all. Like a handful of it, like maybe 30 to 50 is probably fine. Like Champions Trophy with base effectiveness or like 20% effectiveness is enough to get most of the damage dealers in the game. I don't really think you should go crazy sky high, like 100 plus effectiveness, unless for some reason you just want your designer a little bit to function like a Judge Kisei and have the ability to reset everybody on the enemy team, including Soul Weavers. I feel like you're just going to have too much of a loss of stats to really go for it. If you're trying to play, like I said, that counter control style of Lilibet, then you can play, again, like a handful of effectiveness, like 30 to 50 with Champions Trophy, as high as like maybe 70. That will be more than enough, I think, to get almost every character in the cast that actually matters, that's not a cleanser or high ER character. Taking a look at the right side here, I have a crit damage necklace, although if you're struggling to hit a lot of the critical hit chance numbers on this character, you can also play a crit chance necklace. For ring, it's got to be defense percentage regardless of what your goal is on the character. She just really needs that defense in order to have the effective HP as well as the damage on the character. I guess you could go maybe effectiveness ring if you just wanted to forego it, but I feel like that's just not really going to be a super impactful or great build in the long run. For boots, I have speed, so that way we could take our turns in a timely fashion. That way we can get over that like 185 to 186 speed threshold that we talked about, or we can push for that 220 plus that we were talking about to guarantee that we get that second turn. For artifact, I have nothing listed here because we already talked about all the options in the last section. Which one you choose is entirely up to you, your playstyle, and what you are trying to accomplish with the character. Looking at the per piece average, I have 16% defense, 12% critical hit chance, 7 speed, and then some amount of HP and critical hit damage, both of which are 10%. This second stat line is more in line for players that like to play a turn 2 style of gameplay. You like to play counter set characters. You like to play bruiser characters with a high amount of effective HP. This is going to be for you. I think this is a build that pairs a bit better with certain artifacts that provide some level of control or sustain, like Proof of Valor or like a Sigurd Scythe. If you're looking to play those kind of artifacts, I think that this stat line we're going to talk about is a bit better. Primary sets are still speed or counter, although I think that this stat line lends itself to counter a bit better than the first one, although I've personally in the past played speed on this similar stat line, so you can use that if you so choose. Offsets are all the same ones from the previous one, and it's all for the same exact reasons that we talked about. Desired stats, attack is still 1500 for the same reasons we talked about in the previous section. Defense is 2000. It's because we're trying to get a higher amount of effective HP. You are going to be a slower and or bulkier build with less damage as far as critical hit damage goes, so you might as well make up for that with defense. If you can get 2100 defense, that would be great as well, but ideally like 2000 to 2050 is a good spot for this build. For health, I have 16.5k. That is a bit lower than where I like it. Originally in the past, I had somewhere around like 17.8k HP. I went really high on the HP for this build. Again, we have less damage. We're going to have, a lower amount of critical hit damage on this build in order to have our designer Lilibet just be really tanky and stay on the board as long as possible. So that way we can kind of get the most amount of value out of her S1s, her soul burns, and her S3s over the course of a game. For speed, I have 190 listed here. This should be fine, again, for the most part. If you get provoked by somebody like Conquer Aurelius, it's not going to be fast enough to guarantee you get the second turn if she pushes you back. So if you're looking to guarantee you get that second turn, again, go for that 210 to 220 speed like we talked about in the very first section. Critical hit chance is still 100%. Critical hit damage is 250%, which is kind of just the standard for somebody who wants a little bit of damage but not a ton when you're playing a critical hit damage necklace. In the past, when I had like 17.8k health, I only had like 242 critical hit damage. So if you can't get the whole 250 and your goal is just to have a bulky designer Lilibet with like sustain, like I said on Sigurd Scythe, or just kind of tankiness from Proof of Valor, then by all means you can go lower. And if you want a little bit more damage, like say like 260, if you could squeak it up there, that's fine as well. Again, this is primarily going to be a stat line that's more skewed towards having a bulkier designer a little bit that's trying to stay on the board a bit longer. Taking a look at the right side gear here, I'm still on a critical hit damage necklace, although again, you can still play a crit hit chance necklace if you are struggling to get that critical hit chance, whether that's through not playing an artifact like Azure Comet or not having enough imprints on the character. This would be a fine alternative. Ring is still defense percentage for the same reasons we talked about in the previous section, just gives good bulk as well as good damage. Boots are speed as always so that we can take our turns in a timely fashion. The artifact is still going to be not listed here because of what we talked about in the artifacts discussion section earlier in the video. Looking at the per piece average, we have 24% defense, 16% HP, 12% critical hit chance, and some amount of speed or critical hit damage in the last spot. You can see it's not a lot. It's 3 speed average per piece, which means you could ideally have like 10 speed on one piece, and that'll cover like 3 slots for pretty much your entire build if you're on a speed set. And then critical hit damage, we had 6% here as the per piece average. In this section, as well as the last one, if I didn't make it abundantly clear, all of these stats assume that I'm actually on the speed set. When it comes to drafting teammates for your designer Lilibet, there are 2 goals you want to be accomplishing with your picks. You want to make sure that you have a backup cleanser, so that way if designer Lilibet gets banned, you're not super vulnerable to debuffs. And you also want to be making sure you pick teammates that essentially help checkmate their opener, because usually you're going to be drafting designer Lilibet to counter a very specific opener. So you want to choose teammates that make it so that your opponent is in a no-win scenario. For cleansers, Mediator Coeric and Destina are probably the 2 best options. They're pretty much the 2 best cleansers in the format at this point. If you've watched how to play Mediator Coeric, you already know how good he is. Destina is a great budget RGB 5-star option for many players. She not only is a competent cleanser, but provides combat readiness pushing as well as reviving with her S3. The other characters that I want to highlight in this section, the ones that help checkmate characters, are going to be Desert Jewel Basar, Politis, and Lionheart Sirmia. Essentially, certain openers, when they use either their S2 or their S3, are going to guarantee give your designer Lilibet the S3 model disqualification, which they're probably not going to want to do. But if you choose a character like Desert Jewel Basar or Politis in tandem with a character like Lionheart Sirmia, then they're in a really bad predicament, especially if it's Conqueror Lilius. For example, if Conqueror Lilius S3s, you get model disqualification on your designer Lilibet. If she S2s, then you are going to get an S2 on your DJ Basar, and you're going to get an S3 from him as well, which translates to, you guessed it, an S3 model disqualification from designer Lilibet. If they S1 though, then it will proc Lionheart Sirmia, which means that your Lionheart Sirmia will get a ton of value and probably wipe their entire team. So again, drafting something where you choose like 2 of these 3 characters can put your opponent in a very bad spot as long as you also have designer Lilibet. At this point in the video, it should be fairly obvious what the good matchups are for designer Lilibet. She is very good against a lot of the game's most debilitating openers, as well as some of the really strong debuff characters throughout Epic 7's history. So when you see characters like Conqueror Lilius, Ran, Peyra, Angel of Light Angelica, or even a character like Basar or Fairy Tale Tenebria, you know that it is a fairly good time to pick designer Lilibet, especially those first 3. Conqueror Lilius, Ran, and Peyra. She is excellent against most of those characters. If for no other reason, then it pretty much strong arms them into not using their most debilitating skills. Otherwise, you'll get a lot of advantage. Let's round out the video by talking about designer Lilibet's bad matchups, starting with, shocker, Rimuru Tempest, the character that keeps showing up in this section. When Lilibet procs her S2 emergency stitching, you get a 1-turn defense buff. That means that any attack you take with designer Lilibet will trigger Analyze and Assess, which means that Rimuru can then turn around and use his S3 Devour Black Flame to kill a key target on your team, which could potentially lose you the fight. Even worse, if you cleanse your team with model disqualification and it procs Analyze and Assess, he can then use Devour Black Flame to defense break your whole team, which is arguably worse than being silenced in some scenarios. So keep that in mind. Apocalypse Ravi is another terrible matchup, and I'd argue probably the worst matchup that Designer Lilibet has. Designer Lilibet has no way to actually kill Apocalypse Ravi unless she is extremely low and would die to any attack anyway. All you can really do is kind of annoy her by keeping her silenced or resetting the cooldown on her S3. Designer Lilibet really relies on her team in order to deal with Apocalypse Ravi because she is wholly incapable of containing this beast. So if Apocalypse Ravi is on the enemy team and Designer Lilibet is your only real damage dealer, it's just simply easier to concede and move on to the next match, unless, again, that Apocalypse Ravi is basically one hit away from death and anything would kill her anyway. Blue Kisei as well as Red Koeric are two others that we have to highlight because they are fast characters, and a smart opponent can actually reset our Designer Lilibet before firing off all of their debuffs, and that could essentially cause the value of our Designer Lilibet to plummet, and we could end up losing the game as a result and just become very easily controlled. So these two are ones you have to be aware of. I guess you could also lump Judge Kisei in this same section because resetting Designer Lilibet is just honestly taking away a lot of value from the character. Next up, let's talk about Angel of Light Angelica. Yes, I know I said this was a good matchup in the previous section, but it can also be a bad matchup based entirely on the timing of how model disqualification is used. Yes, you will cleanse the debuffs off of your team, but in turn you will be giving skill nullifiers as well as cleansing one debuff from Angel of Light Angelica's team. And based on those cleanses, as well as when those skill nullifiers arrive, certain characters might take turns that they otherwise shouldn't have, and certain characters on your team might not be able to eliminate key characters when they should have been able to as well. So it's really important that you think ahead and think about how these skill nullifiers and this small cleanse actually affect the big picture of the game. Next up is Politis as a bad matchup. This one should be fairly obvious. Politis reduces the combat readiness gain of all enemies by half. That means that if the enemy has Politis and they're trying to cleave you, for example, the emergency stitching passive will not give you enough combat readiness boost to guarantee you take that second turn, which means you might end up getting cleaved or controlled long before Designer Lilibet actually gets her turn. And then the final two that I want to talk about are Summertime Hysteria as well as Pirate Captain Flan. If you paid attention in the skills section, you'll remember that model disqualification is not actually a true cleanse. It just reduces the timer on all debuffs by 2 turns. Bombs as a mechanic cannot have their timers reduced, which means that Designer Lilibet has no way to actually interact with bombs placed on your team, which means she's not really a good answer to these characters. And that's going to do it for how to play Designer Lilibet. As always, let me know down in the comment section if there is something that I missed or there is a character you want to see in an upcoming how to play video. I recognize that there are a lot of banners up right now and I won't be able to get to all of them, so please let me know which ones you want to see first and foremost. If you want to see more how to play guides in this same style, you can check out a playlist on your screen now. And as always, enjoy the rest of your day, the rest of your week, and I'll catch y'all later. Bye bye now.